Look at this 19th century manuscript. When most readers and scholars approach a classic text like this, they treat the pages as a transparent pane of glass, a direct window into the mind and soul of the person who wrote it. Under this traditional method of criticism, a novel's worth is measured by its biographical accuracy. The text is scanned for the author's personal trauma, relationships, and private beliefs. The secondary approach is equally external. Analysts treat the book as an artifact of its era, scanning the chapters to see how they capture the cultural and political environment of the time. Whether hunting for personal biography or historical context, the reader is doing the same thing, looking right past the words themselves to find an external target. This paradigm relies on a specific assumption. It assumes that language is a passive, invisible delivery mechanism used to transport emotional and historical facts from the writer to the reader. But consider what happens to our understanding of a poem or novel if we strip away the creator. If the author's identity is lost to time, how do we evaluate the writing? And if we look at this abstract diagram of a document and black out the cultural context and publication date, what remains for the critic to study? Without a biography to decode or a historical period to map, standard literary analysis hits a dead end. Traditional critics are left staring at a physical book, unable to explain why a specific arrangement of sentences manages to captivate a reader. The biographical and historical lens treats literature as the exhaust of history. It ignores the actual engineered mechanics of the text sitting right in front of us. Between 1910 and 1930, a movement emerged in Russia that sought to fix this blind spot. They were known as the Russian Formalists. These scholars did not operate like subjective art critics debating the emotional resonance of a chapter. They approached texts with the strict, calculating rigor of structural engineers. They discarded the idea that a book is a window into the past or a mirror of a writer's soul. To understand how a piece of writing works, they argued, analysts must stop treating language as an invisible container for ideas. Words, sentences, and syntax must be examined as physical, opaque materials that have their own weight, texture, and logic. We are going to apply the formalist framework to a piece of text, reverse engineering it to expose the raw architecture of poetic language. The Russian formalists analyzed literature as an engineered machine, setting aside the emotional reflections of life to study the structural assembly. The first logistical step in the formalist method is drawing a strict boundary around the object of study. Look at this model showing a book tethered to its creator and its era. The formalist method requires us to actively sever these structural ties. A text's artistic value cannot depend on conscious intentions or hidden psychological motives, snapping the connection to biographical meaning. Next, the writing must be detached from political and cultural movements. The manuscript is now isolated in a vacuum, sealed inside its own closed system. The formalists identified this specific, isolated state as the autonomous nature of literature. When a text is autonomous, it is cut off from reality. It cannot borrow emotional weight from real-world tragedies or historical facts to generate its artistic power. This rule applies universally, governing the strict stanzas of a poem just as rigidly as the continuous paragraphs of a prose novel. If the impact of a story cannot come from the outside world, the energy must be generated from within. By isolating the text, the formalists shifted the analytical burden away from history and directly onto the internal, physical mechanics of the language itself. Once a document is suspended in an autonomous vacuum, we face a practical problem. What exact metrics are we supposed to measure? We have to separate semantics, which is the dictionary meaning of the words, from the actual construction of the sentences. The formalists chose to ignore the semantic definitions and instead measure a text's formal properties. This diagram illustrates a formal property. When we strip away the story, the paragraphs resolve into an abstract architectural wireframe, revealing measurable structural features. These structural features include the rhythm, meter, syntactic repetition, and the acoustic patterns of the syllables. Everyday utilitarian speech is designed to transmit data as quickly as possible. It minimizes these repeating structures to avoid getting in the way of the message. Poetic language operates in the opposite manner. It intentionally amplifies and manipulates those structural properties, so the reader is forced to notice them. The formalists did not view this type of writing as the result of mystical inspiration. They saw it as a calculated, deliberate distortion of ordinary speech patterns. Writers achieved this distortion by employing highly specific structural techniques, which the formalists classified as literary devices. Literariness is the threshold where utilitarian language becomes poetic. By calculating the frequency of rhythmic nodes and syntactic loops, the formalists could determine the exact degree of structural transformation. To warp basic communication into art requires a catalyst. We need to identify the exact mechanism that powers this structural transformation. The formalists identified a master device responsible for this process, ostrananie. Ostrananie is a Russian term that translates to defamiliarization. Defamiliarization works by attacking the baseline mechanics of human perception. Our brains automatically filter out familiar, routine information to conserve cognitive energy. Here, we see how utilitarian language mimics cognitive automation. The comprehension travels instantly from point A to point B without friction. Ostrananie drops an obstacle onto that automated path. It injects artificial friction into the sentence, tangling the structure and slowing down comprehension. This delay disrupts our cognitive autopilot. Denied immediate access to the meaning, the reader is forced to perceive the physical shape, sound, and texture of the words themselves. The formalists established a direct correlation. The longer human perception is delayed by this linguistic friction, the higher the text scores on the scale of artfulness. Ostrananie demonstrates that literary brilliance is an engineered outcome. It relies on aesthetically motivated devices designed to break our automated perception of the world. We have completed the formalist teardown. We stripped away the author's biography, discarded the historical context, and isolated the language inside a vacuum. Look at the rebuilt structure in this diagram. By interlocking the rhythmic patterns with the jagged delays of defamiliarization, we assemble a system that relies on internal formal properties. Under this framework, a novel operates as a self-sustaining closed-loop machine. It generates its own aesthetic value through the internal friction of its moving parts. Between 1910 and 1930, the Russian formalists codified a method that allowed scholars to measure the mechanics of written art. True literary analysis requires us to stop staring through the pages in search of historical ghosts. We must open the casing, examine the components, and study the architecture of literariness at work.